Hey, welcome. So tonight we are very fortunate to have Kirk come along and discuss. I see it, and he will probably say something different. But the role of poetry in one's life and how this can foster and enhance meaning, and I would say tremendous positive emotion that comes from the appreciation of good poetry. And I have to admit that I'm no expert on poetry at all. Um, and we were discussing beforehand, and I sort of spoke from a position that seems to be quite recognized out there.
Mhm.
The poetry tends to either be brilliant or awful, and there doesn't seem to be much in between. And I think poetry, from my own experience, is incredibly difficult to get right. And maybe that's part of what makes it so satisfying. Um, but I really look forward to hearing what you have to say about that, Kirk. And I just want to clarify that as I said, I'm no expert on poetry, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. I am a huge fan and absolutely adore um, what I might call very sophisticated song lyrics, and there seems to be this line between poetry and, there's certain song lyrics that are just definitely not poetry, and then there's works of Dylan, Leonard Cohen, people like that can be read standalone as beautiful poetry as well. And I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on that maybe later on as well. But over to you, Kirk. Thanks very much, and thanks for coming to join us tonight.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. It's great to see who I can see and hopefully hear from who I can hear from. I think it's interesting to talk about the lyrics song aspect versus poetry, and is there a big difference? There's not a firm definition of what poetry is in the way that you might get with like science, right? Or with poetry, there tends to be a feeling that this is poetry, this isn't. Roses are red, violets are blue. Is that really poetry, or is that just like a cutesy rhyme? And I think it was Emily Dickinson who said, "I know when I'm reading poetry when it feels like the top of my head has come off." And there's something of power, evocative language that's there that I think is also there in song as well. In fact, I do a show with a museum painting guy, a docent. We do a show called Surprised by Art. And just last week, we did a show using the unofficial, where I chose a poem for this show, and he chose a painting. And the poem I chose to go with Righteous Defiance was actually the English unofficial national anthem. And by the way, do you guys know what that is?
From where I'm coming from, a sort of unofficial anthem is Jerusalem.
Yes, that's the one we covered by William Blake.
Yeah.
And that was written as an introduction. When he wrote it in 1804, it's an introduction to a long epic poem, or epicness, or epic-like. It's not a fully epic, but called To Milton. So he's actually writing to Milton, and and the poet Milton of Paradise Lost. And he writes this thing about Jerusalem, and bring me my bow of burning gold, and bring me my arrows of desire. But it was put into song during World War I, and it's I think it's Rupert Perry who put it into his song form, and it's a moving song when sung. So now the question is, does it add to it? I think it does add to it in that case, and he didn't write it to be the national anthem. In fact, I think he wrote it to kind of criticize England at the time a little bit, to like subtly criticize it and talk about how beautiful it was. But I think it's important to think that there probably is a difference between poetry and music, but that doesn't mean that if you're feeling something of the words of music that it's less poetic in a sense. And what I mean by that is, one value of reading poetry by itself is that you get the full resources of language. And this is, I think, an important thing for us to chat about today in terms of understanding why poetry is important and why it's resonating and powerful for us. And I think about like our daily lives even, and how often are we confused in our daily lives, right? Like, I know you do psychology as your expertise, and you do retreats, and I imagine a big part of that is helping people gain a clarity on their own life, to gain meaning from things like that they might have some feelings of chaos and uncertainty about. Is that correct?
Definitely. So my work is sort of seems to be split between very acute issue problems that people have, sort of to do with, say, trauma and addiction and things like that. And then once people have worked through that, then the next piece of work is always around purpose, meaning, and self-esteem. And
Yeah.
And that it's, you sort of do this jump between very tangible problems to this much broader, in objectivist terms, issues of sense of life and things like that.
Very hard to grasp what a sense of life really is, right? And even what your sense of life is. And I think this goes to the core of literature itself. And I believe poetry is the first form of literature and probably the most pure, in a sense, actually. Even more than drama, than novels, which I love novels. I love short stories. Those are, probably my favorites, right up there with poetry. But there's something in poetry, and I'll give you a quote from Robert Frost, the American poet, because I have a lot of love for English poets, particularly the English romantics are my kind of favorites. So by the way, I feel kind of weird being the American talking to the English about English poetry.
Yeah, but that's a bit like the old British musicians from the 60s and 70s telling Americans about American music. Yeah,
exactly. And there is something where maybe I can have a different appreciation for it because maybe I was separated from it. I didn't really experience it. I mean, I hated poetry till I was 28, by the way. I'm 35 now, I'm about to be 35. So I always hated poetry. I loved reading literature and even classic literature, but like you were saying at the beginning, I totally understand where people are coming from, man, with hate. Like, this stuff doesn't make sense. It just doesn't a lot of times, like more often than not. And the quote by Robert Frost, by the way, is, I'm actually kind of paraphrasing this off the top of my head, but he said that a poet's meaning is like an ice cube on a hot stove. It rides on its own meaning. And what I think he meant by that is, when you read a poem, or what I say, reread a poem, and I hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to read some really short poems together and kind of talk about what they can do for us and what they feel for us. But when you read a poem, it often doesn't make sense. And I mean, but how many times have we had a conversation with somebody, we were at a party and the interaction didn't make sense, or we look at social media or news or the events of the world and things don't make sense. Like, we just don't understand what's going on. I think that's probably a regular thing. But what poetry is good at, when it's good, like you said, is that when you look at the poem again, so as I put it, it's not, poems are not meant to be read, they're meant to be reread. Because you have to have the totality of the work of art in order to unlock everything that came before it. And so it has this totality to it. And in that is the making of meaning. And take the word making seriously. Making, like making a pie, right? There's ingredients to it. There's elements to it. There's different ways of looking, there's different ways to make different kinds of pies. And so when you're thinking about making meaning, this is a process that has to be trained in us. And I think it's really unfortunate that we, and I include myself in this, are often not given the tools early on to make meaning from poetry, to look at poems and literature in general and understand them, and being able to decipher them for ourselves without having, maybe without having someone tell us, or, having just inaccessibility to it. So that's my first kind of pitch to, like, poetry is going to be confusing. That's the nature of poetry. But that's also the nature of life. That's how we experience life on a regular basis. But part of what happens is, when you go through it and you read it, you look up words, you ask yourself, what does this word mean? What does that word mean? And you start to unlock what the poet is trying to convey. So does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I tell you what struck me the most, what you were talking about there, is I hadn't thought of it this way, but one, that poetry is to be reread and reread. And I totally get that. Like, if I read a Chekhov short story, I don't want to reread it and reread it and reread it straight away, etc. But like a good poem, I want to reread. And as you mentioned, getting the whole totality of it is essential. And I hadn't ever thought of it like that, but I understand what you're saying now from my own experience.
Yeah. Okay. So let's try to engage with some poetry. A really short 2-stanza poem that might help. And here, this is a poem by your own Alfred Lord Tennyson, again, a Victorian English poet, and it's a very simple poem. And I want to set it up with one. I'm going to read actually a little segments of a dictionary, because I want to convey that there are 3 uses of language, essentially fundamental uses. That this is not just me saying this. This is, if you come up with a different one that doesn't fall under these 3, please let me know. But I think language, which is how we interpret the world, it's how we interact with the world, it's how you can communicate to your clients. It's when we're thinking about psychology, it's our self-talk. It's how we talk to ourselves, how we, see ourselves in the world. We interact at a party and we walk away from that party and say, man, I was shit at that party. Nobody likes me, right? Like, why do we say, excuse the language, but why do we talk to ourselves that way? Why do we think of ourselves in a certain way, which is using words? There's 3 fundamental ways that I was taught that there are to use language, and that's informative or information, to convey information. This is what you get in an encyclopedia. This is most prose that when we read prose. This is most nonfiction book. You were reading Steve Jobs' biography. That's information. That's primarily about information, conveying information. Sometimes there may be some of another form of language that I'll talk about in a minute. Another form would be like advertising, persuasion, to convince somebody, to sell them on something, right? That's another form of how we use language. I'm going to convince you to buy my vacuum cleaner or my set of knives, or I'm going to convince you to go out on a date with me. Right? Those are ways that we can convince. But the third, and I think the least used in our modern time, and arguably at least as important as the others, if not more important, is experience. The expression and communication of experiences. And when you think about it, no matter how worldly, cosmopolitan we are, no matter how many people we meet, how empathetic we think we are very limited in our lives. We get one go at this thing called life, right? And we can only see a certain amount of people. Even if we see a lot of people, maybe you'll meet a couple thousand people at best. And maybe you'll only get to know a dozen at best, like really get to know. And really, you'll probably only get to know like a love of your life type thing, like maybe 2 or 3 if you're lucky, like if you get to meet someone really strong. That's a limit when you think about the billions of people on the planet alive today, not to mention the billions that have been alive. You'll never get to experience, most of us will never get to experience what it's like to be in space, really. We're at the bottom of the ocean, right? We'll never get to experience revolution, hopefully. Hopefully not a bad, but we may not be able to experience all the love, the jealousy, the hatred, the murder, things that you might get, which we probably don't want to experience, but that I think part of us wants to understand a little bit. So that, I think is one of the core reasons to read literature in general. And I think poetry gives us that. So I'm going to bore you if I haven't already. And I'm going to read a little bit of this encyclopedia on eagles, because I want to convey the difference. And then I'm going to read the poem, which is a short 2-stanza poem. And then I'd love to hear any thoughts or questions you guys might have on other poems. I have a whole slew of poems we can explore, by the way, but it really depends on your general interest. But so let me get into this real quick with eagles. So let's say you do want to learn a little bit about eagles. So if we wanted to, so we might turn to an encyclopedia, and let me find this, Pat. So we'll find things like, we'll find that they are from the family of Falconidae, I don't even know how to pronounce this stuff, to which eagles belong, is characterized by imperforate nostrils, legs of medium length, a hooked bill, the hind toe inserted on a level with the three front ones, and the claws roundly and curved and sharp. And it goes on like that. I won't read all of it, but you can see it's conveying information about the biology, the description, you might see hunting habits, where they are located in the world, where can you find certain kinds of eagles. That's information, right? Now, if you read that type of thing, what you're going to miss is kind of the great power of vision, the height, and what it would feel like to be an eagle, in a sense, or to have that kind of experience. So here's Alfred Lord Tennyson. And this is called, simply enough, it's a 2-stanza poem called The Eagle, simply enough. And here we go, the eagle. He clasps the crag with crooked hands, close to the sun in lonely lands. Ringed with the azure world he stands. The wrinkled sea beneath him crawls. He watches from his mountain walls, and like a thunderbolt he falls. Now, if you have a chance, if you can pull that up on your phone, I'm going to quickly go through it again so you can kind of get a feel for it. But if you read that to yourself out loud, or if I did even a moderately decent job, you should get a different feeling and experience of the eagle. So think about it. He clasps the crag with crooked hands, close to the sun in lonely lands. Right there, you get a feel. You should get a feeling that you have this. If you try to imagine in your head this eagle with he's on a crag, on a rock, with crooked hands. So there's that description of the hooked claws that we talked about in the encyclopedia. And he's there standing on this rock, close to the sun. So he's way up there. He's by the sun. And if you know your mythology, then you might think of ancient mythologies about like the sun god and Phoebus and animals that got too close to the sun and things like that. Ringed with the azure world. Now, I want to ask you guys, because I want you guys to be in part a part of this translation a little bit. What comes to your mind when you hear ringed with the azure world in the context of the poem that I've read so far? Ringed with the azure world he stands. So azure is blue. So this is one thing that's helpful is I have a dictionary on my phone, and I recommend it because I use it all the time. Even with like words that you think in a poem, this is what poetry does wonderfully. Is it helps you understand words, which is how again we interact with each other. So words are very rich in their meaning. Right? So we're talking about meaning. Literally meaning, here's the definition of meaning, what is meant by a word, text, concept, or action. So there's a lot that goes into what a meaning is. Okay, but so
if
now
you take ringed with the azure world he stands,
yeah.
To me, the azure world is would be the great blue sky.
Beautiful. Yeah.
That's what immediately is coming to mind for me. And that those 4-5 words encompasses such a huge amount.
Can you envision that in your mind for a moment too?
Yeah, I'm sort of putting myself in the eagle's head in a way and looking this because I presume that eagles have that incredibly wide vision as well. So I'm just seeing this huge blue sky with maybe a few cotton candy clouds or something in the distance.
You go. I like that. See, you're already becoming more poetic. Cotton candy clouds, right?
Yeah.
There's alliteration for you. So now, what comes into mind with the word ringed? Yeah, and I'm seeing. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your names correctly, Iman and Betty. Yeah, when I first read this poem, I didn't know what azure meant either. I had to look it up. So that's part of why I say poetry is not meant to be read; it's meant to be reread. Because you have to kind of look through the words and define them. And I literally will write in the poem, if I have it on a piece of paper or on a separate sheet of paper, I'll write down all the words that I don't know and all the words that I think I know, but I'm not 100% sure about, right? Like I think azure, I might've been like, oh, I think I know, but I'm not sure. And it helps. Now with that same line, Josh or anybody else, what comes to mind? So you said this bright blue comes to your mind, right? You see this eagle standing on this big crag. Imagine him on a hilltop, way up. The sun is right there. It feels like he's right next to the sun in a sense. What then comes to your mind when you think of the word ringed? Does anything come to your mind?
Surrounded.
So surrounded.
That's what comes to my mind.
100%.
Yeah.
And so surrounded, I think, is part of it. Anybody else have that is true, by the way. But with poetry, there's often more. Can anybody come to something else with it?
Razzie.
Yeah, so, I also thought surrounded. So yeah.
Protected. There you go, Iman. Thank you. So I think protected is definitely true. This is his land, right? He's the king of these lands in a sense. He's, so the protected, I think, is part of it. He's enshrouded by it. It's complete, but he's lonely. He's separated from everybody, right? He's on his crag, and it says on lonely lands. So it has that feeling of being separated, of being alone, but he's not alone in the sense of like a hermit. This is a kingly entity. And so, I think he's surrounded by, he's protected by, and, I even picture, for me personally, I picture the eagle on this crag, this crooked hand, hands, and hands, by the way, not talons. So he's already, personifying, making it human. We have this kingly look, and he's got the whole world is kind of his hat, his crown in a sense. He's ringed with this crown is how I kind of picture it. The wrinkled sea beneath him crawls. He watches from his mountain walls, and like a thunderbolt he falls. Now what comes to mind visually when you think of wrinkled sea?
Well, again, it's very powerful. The wrinkled sea is because he's so high up. The waves that if you were down on the surface would be so powerful and big and moving fast, etc. From high up are these, just as you say, these wrinkled, the water, and it just moving.
Well, I want to build on what you're saying, because I think that's 100% correctly. I mean, look, I think of it literally. If you're in a plane, you look down, you might see the sea kind of looks wrinkled, right? That's maybe a literal description of waves, right? But what emotion comes to mind when you hear wrinkled? Like he could have used wavy sea beneath him crawls. He chose wrinkled, and there's connotation, there's emotion behind that.
It ties in with the crooked hands. The crooked hands remind me of age as well. So it's,
yes,
as Eamon says in there, old, ancient, right? So we're getting this emotion of the feeling behind this eagle. So this eagle is not a young eagle, but that doesn't mean it's weak, by the way. It's still majestic, right? That's the feeling that I'm starting to get, is majestic. And part of that is old, ancient, right? And the sea. So you're getting an emotional connection between this ancient eagle and the ancient sea, right? They're both on the same level in a sense, at least. Although I would, you might argue that the eagle's even a little bit more majestic even than the ocean, because it has the whole world, it's like Atlas with the world on its shoulders. The wrinkled sea beneath him crawls, right? And what does that bring to your mind when you think about a wrinkled sea beneath him crawls? What do you think the poet is expressing there? Well, again, I'm getting a sense here that it's well beneath him. He's like the king, and these these sort of almost pathetic objects or something compared to him.
Right?
Yeah,
totally, man. I think that's 100% correct, and it's conveying and kind of expressing that feeling of beneath him they crawl. They're lesser than him. He's again on this mountaintop. He's heroic and majestic, is the words that come to my mind anyway. Okay, so he watches from his mountain walls, and like a thunderbolt he falls.
Well, again, the first line is like, that's his castle.
Yeah.
To me, it's like this towered castle, these mountain walls. I mean, how powerful is that to have a whole mountain as your wall?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a hell of a wall. And he watches. The fact is that he can see. That says to me, what amazing vision he has, because he can watch and look out from this high height on everything.
Yes. He could watch out over everything. He's the surveyor of the world. We know a lot about, eagles have very keen vision. Like if you read your encyclopedia. So, but how Tennyson is conveying that is by putting him in this epic stance, and that he's on this crag, and he watches from his mountain walls, his castle, which isn't a man-made castle, it's the earth. That's his castle, the whole earth.
Yeah.
And like a thunderbolt. Does thunderbolt, just out of curiosity, does that bring any kind of, what does that convey to you guys? Like what comes into your mind when you think thunderbolt, he falls?
Well, again, for me, and I'm just expressing what's going on for me. It's tremendous speed.
Yes. There you go.
Like as like the speed of light, but also the power of when do we get thunderbolts? When it's a huge storm. And
Eamon said power.
Power, exactly.
Amen. 100% Eamon. Am I saying his name correctly, by the way? I hope.
Yeah, Eamon. Yeah.
Eamon. Okay.
Eamon, yeah.
Thank you.
And in this context, when he falls, it's not for me someone who's falling down. It's him swooping maybe onto his prey.
Yes. You could imagine that. You could visualize it. You can, in a sense, when you read it well, you could feel it. And I'm going to reread it again in a second. I think you can kind of feel it with the rhythm of the sound, the meter, and the rhyme in this case, right? Thunderbolt. And also Thunderbolt, if we know our mythology, has a feeling of Zeus, of godliness. So it's also the literal science of, seeing a thunderbolt come down and the power, the strength, the speed of that. And if you've ever seen an eagle, I've never seen one in real life diving, but I've seen them on videos, and they are intense. Right, like to see an eagle come up and swoop down, pick up a trout, and fly away with it. Right, it's just but you can't feel that. The whole point of why I'm choosing this poem, why we're going through it, is you can't experience that, feel it. You can't internalize it without poetry. You can't do it with even seeing it doesn't have in real life or on a video doesn't quite convey it in the same way as these words do. So let me read it one last time. He clasps the crag with crooked hands, close to the sun in lonely lands. Ringed with the azure world he stands. The wrinkled sea beneath him crawls. He watches from his mountain walls, and like a thunderbolt he falls. So did that feel a little bit different the second time? And I apologize, but I have some construction going on in my house. I don't know if you can hear the hammering. But I mean, did you feel a little bit differently that second time? Hopefully.
Again, my experience is that each time we've gone through it, I found it more emotional.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's something that's coming up. That's something that it seems to me that one of the main goals of poetry is to evoke very strong emotion.
Yep. Just like music in a sense, right?
Yeah. It's this I can see the transition between, the sort of more cognitive side of literature and the more emotional side of music. And this is somewhere in between.
Yeah. And I think there is one of the values and ways of separating poetry from music. And by the way, music is wonderful. I'm not against music or anything. But one way to, separate it is that often the difference is that Alfred Lord Tennyson, and Frost is really big on this, and so is my favorite of all poets ever is William Wordsworth, the Lake poet, and that they often play with meaning, and that there's a dance, it's not necessarily about clarity for its own sake. So, to kind of convey the actual emotion of this eagle in exact specific terms is very difficult, if not impossible to some degree. And it might be different for all of us. We might get, I might get a little bit more majesty and Eamon might get a little bit more power in his sense. Both are correct because the making of meaning in a poem is in you. That's where the poet's landscape, their portrait, what they're drawing on is actually meaning in you. So when you read more poems, you get the sense that you're making meaning by the end of it, but it's very personal to you because those are your words now. Those are your feelings that they're tapping into. It's your experiences. When you think, like, when was a moment when you felt powerful? Right? When was a moment you felt majestic? And this can kind of add to that. And I think that's a really important part of poetry and art that is lost today. So hopefully that was enjoyable.
I really enjoyed it. I really got so much value in actually the breaking it down as well.
Yeah, breaking it down is well, you're not reading poetry if you're not breaking it down and then rereading it. That's why, I mean, with poetry, it's not meant to be read, it's meant to be reread. Because a lot of times we try to read it like prose, and that's a mistake. It's not prose. It's not what you get in, Steve Jobs' biography.
Yeah.
Thank you, Eamon. So I got Eamon. Got a couple of you enjoying. I appreciate it. It's always hard to tell if I can't see your guys' face. And if you have questions, about poetry or about poems in specific, like, I can recommend poems and things of that nature. So
something that I wanted to ask you about in terms of poetry, just from my own experiences, what keeps coming up for me at the moment is how certain poems have lodged in my mind.
Okay, yeah.
So, for example, I can't remember it that well, but I've just Googled it. But do you know Cargoes by John Masefield?
That sounds familiar, but I'm not sure.
I'll post it in the chat. And
yeah.
I had to learn this at school. And it's just
okay.
always stuck with me. Amazing imagery, this poem, of different types of cargo ships. And you've got the Industrial Revolution in the third verse.
Yeah.
But the amount of rhyme that goes in this, and the flow is very, it always stuck with me how powerful it was. And I had to learn this when I was like 10 years old or something, but it stuck with me the whole of my life.
Yeah, so this is one that I would definitely need to be looking up a lot of these words. I have not seen this poem. I'm always shocked at how many poems, even people who don't read poems a lot, that they've read and I've never even heard of. Like, there's just so many poems. It's one of the great things about being alive in the 21st century that we don't recognize, is that we have access to, like, almost every poem ever written that's still in existence. You could just go online and find it. And part of my project is helping people to learn how to unlock those poems for themselves. But we live in a time where you should be able to, and you should regularly, in my opinion, travel on the realms of gold. That's a line from John Keats, another British fella. And this is from On First Looking into Chapman's Homer. And he talks about, you British folk are some of the best with language. And, I at least in my experience, in reading poetry, I think you have the best poetry that I've ever read. And, the greatest poets of all time, when we think about Shakespeare and Wordsworth and Milton, they're all English, right? And so now partly that's because I'm speaking English, and there's also other poets from Baudelaire, from other locations that are great. But I do think the English have a particularly interesting approach to language that the rest of the world can learn from.
Something I'm curious of, what's your opinion of someone like Coleridge?
Coleridge?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of the Romantics, and in fact, I have a magazine called Troubadour Magazine, and one of our goals is to be a defender of the Romantics, Romanticism as a general art movement, but also I focus a lot on the English Romantics. That's Blake, Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley, Byron, and why am I forgetting one? There's one more that I'm forgetting. Wait, Blake, Coleridge. Who am I forgetting? There's one I'm missing right there. But there's a big six, and I don't know how off the top of my head I'm missing one. But anyway, yeah. And Ayman says I liked William Blake from school. We talked at the beginning of his poem Jerusalem. It's a really powerful, emotional poem. It really conveys a sense of how important emotions can be for motivating people to take action. Or like, if I could try and find a little passage from that. But before I actually get into that, I wanted to see if I can make a broader point and get your guys' input on this. So we're all Ayn Rand, and we all enjoy Ayn Rand a little bit, at least. Is that correct? I don't know your group that much, but Ayn Rand had a big impact on my early life.
Yeah.
And, you know, to this day.
I mean, what I'd say something to that, this is
okay.
something that comes up a lot about the English is the same, you know, particularly with art, is, you know, the English are considered stoic, tight, you know, etc. Yet also, if you look at like a lot of the great bands from the 20th century, British, a lot of the great playwrights are British, a lot of the great painters are British. Look at Lord Leighton's amazing romantic painting, etc. There really is an incredibly strong artistic tradition in England as well. And I think that art has always been a way for particularly men to express their emotions, and they've been allowed to express their emotions through art, you know, traditionally, which maybe they're not meant to around the kitchen table or anything like that. But you know that there is that side to English culture that has always really embraced strong emotion as long as it's through art.
Yeah, so I don't know British culture enough to make, you know, an assessment on that level. I do know, you know, I understand in meeting English individuals over time that, and how I'm often described when I'm, you know, as an American, you know, as more loud, brash, more touchy-feely, which feels just normal to me to like shake hands or hug somebody or, you know, like that. But when I, you know, like a British person might say, well, like, and I've, you know, had conversations about people, not all British people, of course. You know, so it's hard. I think what I would say is I think you're right. And in terms of, you know, allowing men, and maybe in particular, but, you know, there also is a level where for whatever reason, and I don't know the historical reasons exactly, in Britain, there has been an absolute love of language. And I think that when you love, you know, language, and like I said, when you think about, there's only three things that you could do with language. It could be this information, which is, you know, I'd put even scientific in that level. You know, there's experience and there's advertising or persuasion type stuff. You know, when you love language, and you know, you're human, whether you express yourself on a day-to-day basis or you're kind of feel like you have to live by certain social norms, right? Like you're not supposed to burst out into song and dance at certain situations and start screaming, you know, hallelujah at any moment, right? But that doesn't mean that individuals don't feel internally very deep emotions. And I think, so I guess my only point is that there's the love of language that I've experienced in you know, the British culture is why they probably are the greatest poets in my view, or some of the greatest poets of all time. And sometimes they don't have, for instance, and I don't want to offend anybody, but like traditionally they didn't have the greatest symphonies, and you know, it wasn't like you would go to Germany, or, you know, you'd go into other cultures to get some of the epic romantic music, but you'd go to England for some of these great poetry and, you know, use of language. And, you know, again, I don't know, I've never been to England, so I don't know enough about it. You know, what kind of traditions. I've read a good amount of your literature, but you know, it's hard to sum up a culture, especially when I'm not from there. I've never been there. But I think you're also right about that. Yeah.
So Kirk, in the chat, Magda said
Yeah.
Wordsworth, and I wonder if, Magda, did you mean Wordsworth when you
Yes,
read that? Was that the person that maybe you missed out of your big six?
Did I miss Wordsworth?
I'm wondering.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Wordsworth. If I miss Wordsworth, that's crazy because he's the one I spend the most time with. So I was silly accident, just a little brain mishap. But so here's one thing that maybe, bringing in Ayn Rand a little bit. So we're talking about Ayn Rand. So I went to, I used to work at the Ayn Rand Institute. I was lucky enough early on, when I went to college, I brought in every speaker from ARI that I could to speak and to speak to me and to my classmates. And I was lucky enough to go through the 4-year Objectivist Academic Center program, where they teach you objectivism, philosophy, communication, and writing and things of that nature, which has been absolutely amazing. One of the things that I learned from Ayn Rand and from studying her is something she said in The Art of Fiction, actually. And I should say that, I am a fiction writer. It's something I have been doing since my whole adult life. Or I was trying to do, I should say. And one thing she said is very applicable to fiction writers or to writers of all types, but also fundamental to living and thinking as a human being, period. And what she talked about is this an epistemological fact that she talked about, is that for fiction writers, let's say, if you want to convey independence, like, a Howard Rourke character, you can't say of the person that they're independent, and you can't have other people say he's independent. You have to show independence. You have to give concrete examples of he's independent, and you have an example of, everyone else is dressing one way, but because he's an architect and he gets dirty, he dresses another way. He doesn't care about his attire or what people think about him, and that's what independence means. Although that doesn't mean he might wear a suit if he cares about the event, right? So there's all these different elements, concrete examples throughout the Fountainhead, for instance, showing in concrete example independence and his independence versus non-independence of other characters. Don't tell, show. Same with film, Josh. Absolutely. And with film, you don't really have a choice. You're only showing, right? Because you have a camera right there.
Or terrible film or a terrible script will tell you at the beginning of the scene, and you already know that it's going to be a bad film.
Yeah, and they'll tell more than show, and they'll have like the Greek chorus too much, right? Where they'll have, like a group of, like in a romantic comedy, this is a cliche, you'll see a group of women in some group, and they'll be commenting on essentially what's going on in the plot, right? In order to kind of hammer it home. Now, there's some, room for that, by the way. I don't think that's always poorly done. But so being able to do that, though, of having concretes for your abstractions, what does independence mean to you? What does meaning, when you say, I'm searching for meaning in life, what does the word really mean to you? Is it just an empty abstraction? Or can you have an infinite amount of concretes to give you examples of what meaning is? For instance, here's a story that just came to my mind. Like you walk in, you're a boss, you walk into a room and all the coworkers are standing in a corner in that room. And then you say, what's the meaning of this? Right? To me, that's one understanding of what the word meaning is. That's a concrete example of meaning. And when people, and because the idea is, I don't understand what's going on. So when I think about meaning, I'm trying to gather meaning from this location. And then people turn around and say, surprise, and now you got the meaning. The meaning is it's a surprise birthday party, right? Versus another meaning where they're all evading their work and they're just kind of looking at a laptop or something in the corner. So what does meaning mean to you? What does independence? What does dependence? What does justice mean? What does heroicism? What about love? What about romance? What about the difference between, what about madness and, the line between madness and sanity? What do those words mean? How do you understand those concretely? And here's the metaphor that Ayn Rand made. She said that you need to be able, as a thinker and a writer, but as a thinker, as a human, you should be able to dance between concretes and abstractions. If you understand something, so if you're trying to define and explain to people and persuade people, for instance, on capitalism and why capitalism is important, or what freedom is and why it's important to our society, you need to you need to feel like you can dance between abstractions and the concretes that add up to those abstractions. And what I would say is that poetry is the best training ground for that. for that kind of dance. It's the play of words. And when you do it constantly, when you really, and I don't want to scare you that you have to do it all the time, but if it's, like going to the gym, you should go to the gym. You should work out, right? You should go to the gym. You should work out your body. Reading poetry, reading literature is the same thing for the mind. So that's my long pitch
It's a
for
great
literature
pitch.
and poetry.
Yeah, it's a great pitch. I've just done that thing where I was just about to say something, and it's just gone.
Oh,
The
man, I'm
context of what you're
sorry.
saying. No, it'll come back in like a few seconds. Oh well.
Well, I can ask a question while
Yeah,
you.
go for it. Yeah, go for it. Please do, Rosie.
So, yeah, Josh mentioned at the beginning that he's far from an expert on poetry, and I think that's true of me, probably even more so. And what would you recommend to somebody who is completely new to poetry? I mean, when you read through The Eagle, and explained it, that was very helpful. And the poem that Josh posted in the chat, I think would take a lot more from me as a newbie to understand. Is there any poem or poet that you would recommend starting?
So, one, I wouldn't necessarily recommend a poet, but if you want to explore stuff on your own, here's what I would do. I would get an anthology of great poetry, not written in the past, poetry that's not really within the last 50 years. So try for classic poetry to start, actually. Because I found that there's certain movements in poetry that have made it difficult to assess good poetry in modern times. Not to say that it doesn't exist. Who's your poet laureate? I had a person on my show. Oh, I completely forgot. He has good poetry, by the way. But I would recommend getting an anthology of poems, not necessarily new ones, but classics, and just kind of glancing through them, reading a line or two, reading a poem if you think it makes sense. If you don't like it, just move on. Don't be hard on yourself. Just if you don't get it, don't force yourself to get it, especially when you're getting new at it. Just kind of explore a little bit. Just kind of flip through once in a while, look at something. You spend like 5 minutes every other day doing this or something, and then when you find something you like, Simon Armitage, thank you. He does have some good poetry actually for a modern. At least I've found it. I haven't explored him entirely. So, that's one thing that I would do. Another thing is there are a lot of people like me who are enthusiastic like me. Like my favorite is Lisa Van Dam, who also teaches poetry. I've learned a lot from her, in fact, including a lot of the stuff that I told you guys today were from books she recommended to me. So, I've kind of picked up, like this eagle example is from a book she recommended. So she has a lot of material that you can find, and you can read her, or you can listen to her. She'll read it and she'll describe it. So learn from people like us. I have a podcast with probably 200 poems that you can listen to where I, discuss it. I set it up. I do what I call converse with verse, which I go line by line after I read it, and then I read it again to kind of help you break it down. And then once you've, gotten one that you like, you can, hopefully take it home with you like the eagle. And I hope you guys look at the eagle again on your own. And when you look at it, now it's going to make sense the next time you read it. Wait a week, go to it, and you're not going to have any problem reading that poem now that you've done the work. And so a lot of what I do on that podcast is helping. The new podcast I started with Luke Travers is called Surprised by Art, where the audience selects a topic. And, like the last one we did was Righteous Defiance. He selected a painting that I'd never seen, and he surprised me with it. And then we went through the painting in his, process. And then I chose a poem that he never heard of, which in this case was Jerusalem. And then I surprised him and we walked through it. So that our approach means is not for non-professionals, right? You do not need to have a PhD degree to use our approach. That's the whole point. And literature is not meant for academia. It's not. That's where it's studied. And it's an unfortunate reality. But when the poets wrote it, they did not mean it freaking guys in ivory towers to dissect every little weird nuance or what they ate for breakfast. What it was meant for was to touch the hearts of the people, you, throughout all time. And that's the purpose of it. And so, a lot of it's been unfortunately confiscated, but, to answer your question in a short sentence, listen to people like Lisa, if I could say like my podcast, and explore, will help you. So.
I've just remembered what it was that I was going to say.
Good.
Yeah, because it literally came 5 seconds after Razzie started asking his question, which always happens. Someone explained to me once what goes on in the brain, in the mind when that happens, and I can never remember it, which is really annoying. But when it was broken down, it's to do with networks and networks becoming like log jammed. But you were talking about the dance between abstract and concrete.
Yeah.
And I find that is one of the most crucial methods that I have to make explicit with clients. When someone goes, I'm depressed.
Yeah.
Give me some examples of how your depression is manifesting. Oh,
Yep.
I don't know. Or when someone's trying to say, I've had a really shit day, or whatever it is. And it can be a lot more complex than that. The dance between what they're thinking and what the reality and the concretes they mean by that are essential for me to grasp the problem for a start. And often it shocks the client because when they make something concrete and they do that dance, they start to make much more sense of what's actually going on.
And they can almost answer their own own problem. They can almost solve their own problem, right?
That happens nearly every time.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you that linkage is, as you say, it's clearly a human need. Yeah, it's not just in poetry or literature. It's just a need to do that dance. Otherwise, you just become so rationalistic.
And that's what meaning means. That's the meaning of meaning, is doing that dance in a sense, is having that dance. And it's why I think it's so important, because we aren't given the tools to do that. Like what I've learned is that what goes on in most people's head, just in conversation with them, which by the way is the only way I can know what's going on in your head, is by your words and your actions to some degree, but especially your words. That's how I can know the content of a person's head. And because I can't obviously read minds. So if I could read minds, it'd be very interesting. But one thing I've come to discover is that this is true of myself. So I'm going to talk about myself. Most of the stuff that goes on in your head isn't thinking. It's like sloganistic cliches. It's your regurgitation of other people's slogans, and we might call it headline thinking today. And that's most of what goes on in my head, except when I'm like writing, for instance, or talking to somebody good discourse. This is what discourse is I say something you don't agree with or you do agree with, and then we go off and you say, oh, give me an example. That's, or elaborate on that. Or wait, that's too much examples. Can you explain to me what you mean by that, right? That's the process by which we as humans gain meaning. And poetry teaches you that as well. So I think like for what you do, Josh, I would really recommend exploring some poetry, because it could be a good way for you to expand your own psychological verbiage, right? Your expansive experiences that you can communicate, and also just, again, the practice of doing it will expand your abilities, I think. And this is true of all of us in whatever we do. I tell this also for advertisers. Like I got my start in sales. I mean, you were reading the Steve Jobs biography. One of his biggest early sales that he did was to the CEO of Coca-Cola. And the way he sold him is he said, do you want to sell sugar water the rest of your life, or do you want to put a dent in the universe? That's poetry.
Yeah.
That's poetic. And that's also advertising in a sense. It's poetic. It's a good use of words. And when you actually look at his biography, and I've read a couple of his biographies.
I'm actually, funnily enough, I finished that one very quickly. I'm now onto this one.
That's my favorite one. The other one I thought was garbage, to be honest. That one I thought was fantastic.
The the one that I read, which I actually really enjoyed, because it
Okay,
was like,
good.
but in a way that it was just like a Wikipedia page, a very long Wikipedia page. It didn't really go into much psychology. I didn't learn anything about his methods or the way he thought, but it gave me a lot of background information for me to expand upon. And actually,
Yeah.
it gave me one thing that wasn't made explicit, but I realized about Steve Jobs. Is Steve Jobs always adhered to the crow.
Oh yeah. Okay.
So even with Apple, like when he came back in, he was like, "Got too many products. We need to focus on 3 or 5. That's only how much we can hold in mind." And I noticed that he had that principle through nearly everything that he did, even if he wasn't aware of it in that way. I found that very that came through in that biography. But
he had an instinct for it. Betty was asking which Steve Jobs autobiography. So the biography, who is the author of the one? It's called Becoming Steve Jobs.
Yeah, this one is by it's actually by 2 people. They wrote it together, Brent Schlender and Rick Tedesli or something. And this
but I think it's. Oh, go ahead.
I can just put it up to the screen.
Yeah, Brent. So the one I like about, personally, what I like about this one is the relationship with Brent and Jobs. So Brent knew Steve Jobs over like 30 years. He was a writer for, I think, Wired magazine. And he knew Steve Jobs, and he wrote about him. And so he has a better perspective of the trajectory of Steve Jobs' career versus the other biography, which was the official biography chosen by Jobs. Jobs chose the author, who was also the author of Walter Isaacson, who also wrote the Benjamin Franklin and
did he do Kissinger? Was it?
I don't know. He's done quite a few.
Right.
Edison, I was thinking, and he also did Edison, and that's why Jobs really wanted him, because he wanted to be, in the same league as Edison. He saw himself as an Edison. Personally, I don't think Isaacson did a wonderful job, because it's basically a smattering of facts about his life, often disconnected, weird anecdotes. Like, he spends a lot of time talking about his carrot diet.
It's not particularly well integrated, and I think that's if we go back to poetry, like that eagle poem that you showed us there was so well integrated into a whole, that how essential that is. And I'm thinking of that in terms of great songwriting is similar, that it all integrates to the theme of the song or the theme of the poem. And
Betty asks a great question. What is the purpose of poetry? And if I had to sum it up in a sentence or a single thought, it would be the purpose of poetry is to communicate experience. So it's not to make you feel better necessarily. There are many experiences. So this is one thing that I get a little bit annoyed by people, is there's 2 things I think people do wrong. Is they look for like anecdotes. They go to poetry to look for a specific, I want an answer to this problem, right? I need like a sermon to give me an answer to what I'm going to do. And it doesn't often do that. Sometimes it can, but it can definitely convey an experience. Another great poem that I love is that I recommend everybody read, Dulce et Decorum Est. Have you guys ever read that poem? Dulce et Decorum Est. Again, a British individual, and he wrote this. The Latin is, "It is sweet and becoming to die for one's country," and it's a wonderful poem about the horrors of war. So it's a kind of irony on that Horace Latin statement, "Dulce et Decorum Est," and you have to read it. It's a little bit longer. I'll say what Betty just said in a second. So the poem is a little bit longer, so we don't probably have time for it. But I recommend checking it out, reading it slowly, and rereading it a couple times. It's, even if you don't get it, it's worthwhile. Trust me. And if you need a couple questions You guys are always free to email me. I'll put my email in there. I don't care, kirkbarbera@gmail.com. We can put it in the links. You guys can always email me. I think I've done a Troubadour podcast on that poem. But yeah, it's a but it's a really scary, horrifying, bad, negative, tragic, sorrowful poem. It's not pleasant. It doesn't make you feel good. That's not the point. There's a poem by Shakespeare called Winter, which is, about, and this is winter in the 1500s. This is like bad, sad, it's horrifying, it's brutal, but it's important, I think, for the totality of human experience to experience all things, including the negative. I know there's a focus that we want to be positive all the time, and that's great. But sometimes in order to understand the positive, you have to have the negative, right? Like I talked about the Jeep commercial. Us Americans are already starting to capitalize on this lockdown. And I'm getting these Jeep commercials, and they're like, now that you've been locked up for 3-4 months, don't you want the freedom of a Jeep, right? And they have all these images of Jeeps going. And yeah, because I feel it. Like I have a Harley. I ride a Harley motorcycle. It's like, man, I want to go somewhere. Like I've been trapped for too long. I want to go hit the open road and feel free again. Yes. Now, sorry, but Betty said one thing. So what is the purpose of so poetry is not to give answers, but to inspire you to discover and create your own answers. And I would say that's, a big part of it. It's not to solve. It's not always to solve. Sometimes it can. Poetry does not always solve, but it can often salve, be a salve for the soul. So and yes, it also trains you to do that dance. It's kind of the exercise, the calisthenics of the mind. So I think that's another benefit.
So it's the question I wanted to ask is, why do you think there's such little, or is there any reference to poetry in the Romantic Manifesto? And
okay, that's awesome. Go ahead. What were you going to say? Because I have something just for that, but go ahead.
And I was going to say, nothing's coming to mind. And I wondered whether you could expand on why you think why, or is it considered a lesser art, or was it just time? Or
a friend of mine just sent this to me recently from the Ayn Rand letters. And she said, here's a quote from Ayn Rand to a poet, an award-winning poet, complimenting him on his work. Here's a section, or 2 sentences or whatever. I do not know, or quote, I do not know whether you will understand me when I say that I love poetry so much that I'd never read it. I think that poetry is the highest and most exacting of arts. Therefore, it should be perfect or nothing. And it is perfect so seldom. And I totally get Ayn Rand's opinion on that. I think that's why. I don't think she was an expert in poetry is my sense, but she does have some incredible recommendations. Invictus, the Westerner poem, or some of her favorite poem of all time is the Westerner. And I'm blanking on the author of the Westerner, but I can find it for you guys in a minute. Invictus is another one. She loved Ulysses by Tennyson, which is a great poem. And so in the Romantic Manifesto, she does mention poetry a few times, but not that concrete. The main thing she says is that poetry is primarily about style, which is true. It's primarily style, but her focus is in the Romantic Manifesto is heavily on her own art more than any other art. Although she talks beautifully about painting, and she has a lot to say about music and art and cognition. And she mentions a little bit about poetry in that essay, I believe. But I don't know enough about her. As much as I've read about her, I don't know everything about her. Everything she's ever said, I would refer to other experts like Shoshana Milgram. She would know much more. Shoshana, that you guys had on last time, call her back and ask her. She might have, or maybe I'll have her on my show and we could talk about it. But so that's my assumption, is that she really loved it, but for her it was pretty rare to find something great. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't. And I almost wonder if Ayn Rand was being hyperbolic when she said I never read it, because she obviously read it. She was writing to an award-winning poet that she loved. So I don't know 100%. her feelings on it. I do know she thought, as she said in that letter, that it's the highest of the arts. One thing I do know she said, according to Leonard Peikoff, was that fiction writing, prose fiction writing, can be taught, but poetry writing cannot be taught. It's only on the realm of genius. Like, only geniuses can do it well. And, there are very few geniuses, which is one of the reasons why I say, read the classics. Like, don't worry about if there's geniuses today. There's plenty of literature to read and poetry to read of the past. So Betty asked, Badger Clark wrote The Westerner. Bob, thank you. Yes. Badger Clark, it's a wonderful poem. I taught 8th grade for a little while. Actually, we would do that poem as one of our little recital things. Betty was asking, what does it mean for something to be poetic? Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure how, so one way to think about it is going back to the eagle. So we can look at the biology of the eagle. We could read that, encyclopedia explanation of the eagle, but the core question to ask is, does it convey an experience? And I don't just mean describe an experience. Like, you should be able to feel, hear, this is why the senses are so important in poetry, and having imagery and the sound of the words and the meter and the rhythm are important. Even if you don't know how to dissect that, you do feel it when you hear poetry.
Yeah, so I just want to throw this in there, that we use the word poetic, don't we, when we use it a lot with sport. We describe something as being very sort of beautiful and well put together as poetic. That move was poetic, and so on. There's definitely an element there that it means it's there's an emphasis on beauty, I think, when we use the word poetic.
Yes.
And very well put together.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Harmony I think is, which I think broadly applies to art, right? It's about harmonious, putting together the elements on a piece of canvas for a painting, right? So I think that's definitely true. Let me do this. So talking about your unofficial national anthem, Jerusalem. So I won't do the whole thing, but let me read this editorial from the 1960s. Sorry, 2 sentences. I'm not going to read the whole editorial, don't worry. 2 sentences from this editorial, and then I'm going to read this poem. It's the same thing with the eagle, but I think you guys may be a little bit more familiar with this poem, so we won't have to break it down in the same way. So, and this is to Betty asking, what does it mean for something to be poetic? And I'm just going to re-emphasize something I mentioned with the eagle. So here's the editorial. We may unhesitatingly assert that we shall not lessen our efforts, nor cease to struggle in this great conflict for human happiness and moral welfare until our objectives have been clearly obtained. I mean, you could hear a protester, if there was an eloquent one who stood for something, a protester today saying something like that, right? We're not going to stop until our objectives are met. Here's how Blake says the same sentiment. Bring me my bow of burning gold. Bring me my arrows of desire. Bring me my spear, O clouds, unfold. Bring me my chariot of fire. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem, in England's green and pleasant land. That conveys the same sense and feeling of social justice, of achieving a perfection in England, for instance. Bring me my bow of burning gold, right? Like, there's a power, and he's talking about the inner emotion as well as the action. As I'm going to take action, I will not cease from mental fight. And he's conveying this in, the arrows of desire, which are the arrows for this burning goal of passion, of accomplishing this mission that he's on. And his arrows of desire, kind of his arrows of aspiration. These are the things we're going to accomplish. We're going to have peace. We're going to have freedom. We're going to have, progress. Bring me my spear. These are weapons, imagery that he's going to fight for this thing. And it's the same thing that editorial was saying. It's the same thing you might hear in a protester saying today, except it's conveyed poetically. And so I think the difference, like I said, to sum it up, is it conveys the totality of an experience. When you experience something, you experience the emotion, the fear, the anger, the passions that you have internally, as well as you might see these images. So I hope that kind of helps. The only way to really understand it is to read lots of poetry. And to some degree, that's what that's what you have to do, is you have to read lots of poetry. And something called taste, you do have to develop a taste. I do think you have to, like, this is why it's so hard at the beginning, because it takes a while of reading poetry to develop that taste. So Bob said something interesting. Yeah. So I didn't read this earlier, but I think something is poetic when it conveys values, emotions, particularly emotions, right? Because emotions are your response to a value. So it may not be so there are poems about values, but Jerusalem, for instance, the poem is about a utopia. So it's a value. It's something that we want, but it's a very broad, abstract value. And it's really, it gets the sense of, I'm going to fight for this perfect world that I want to live in, right? And I don't know exactly what that looks like, but it's, something that I want.
There's something that I just wanted to post to go back to what we were saying right at the beginning, and I think I think one of the jobs of poetry, or not the jobs, but one of the things that poetry does is it evokes a huge amount of, I think, a lot of visual analogy. I see huge scopes of worlds or the world in 3 lines, for example, with the eagle, etc. And I just wanted to post to you a couple of verses from one of my favorite songs, which is "Shelter from the Storm" by Bob Dylan. But I want you to see, like, the character in Dylan writes a lot about characters, and the character in this song is you'll see what's going on, and the beauty of someone bringing you in, like when you see an angel or something, a beautiful woman. And I've always found this very powerful. And that the use of strong metaphor.
Are you going to sing this to us?
I'm not going to sing this at all. I think we're going to look at this. We're going to look at this as a poem.
Okay.
So when it says, "I'll give you shelter from the storm," that should be the end of the verse. It's not put the gap in the chat for some reason.
Okay.
But I was burned out from exhaustion, buried in the hail. So already you've got this. It's quite dramatic. Hail is considered one of the, dramatic weather form, isn't it? We think of hail and storms, and we don't just think of rain, we think of the hail. Poison in the bushes and blown out on the trail. Hunted like a crocodile, ravaged in the corn. So that a crocodile being hunted is a very strong, crocodile is so dangerous. And to think of the crocodile being hunted, ravaged in the corn, it makes me think of like farmers protecting their crops or something. Come in, she said, "I'll give you shelter from the storm." So he comes in, and suddenly I turned around and she was standing there with silver bracelets on her wrists and flowers in her hair. So suddenly you've got this peace, this beautiful, peaceful object that's the savior, this woman who's become a savior. And you go from the hail and the crocodile and ravaged and blown about to suddenly she was standing there at the peace, silver bracelets on her wrists and flowers in her hair, something incredibly beautiful and feminine and rescuing. She walked up to me so gracefully. And so she's the complete opposite of him. He's beaten and down. She's this beautiful savior, and took my crown of thorns. Well, the crown of thorns, we all know, what that evokes. Come in, she said, "I'll give you shelter from the storm." And that's just 2 verses of 10 or 12. And what I've always found incredible about Dylan is, I think, and I was talking about this with Greg Salmieri, is we both kind of agreed with this, that we thought Dylan is probably, if not the best, one of the best people at putting words to music. That's what he wasn't necessarily the greatest musician, it's a lot of great music and very pretty melodies he came up with, but his ability to put
them together
was part of his genius. And
I do like this song.
And he is very, very, very visual, Dylan. You come up with, compared to, it's not like rubbing. He's the complete opposite of someone writing about rubbing up against someone in the club. Which used to be most pop music. Dylan has wrote hundreds and hundreds of there's something called the Basement Tapes, which was a whole bunch of songs that he wrote that he just cast away, and people scavenged those tapes and made whole careers from covering those songs. And
that's awesome.
And if you even if you really study a song like Knocking on Heaven's Door as a poem and break it down line by line, you get a very similar experience to what I received going through the Eagle with you today.
No, I could definitely see that. And I think that's one of the reasons I like Dylan as well. I don't think I've done the kind of analysis that you're talking about, but I see the imagery there. I see the love of words that he has. He has something that he's trying to convey. And I think that's, 100% true. But I would say that it is primarily more music and folk music than, pure poetry. And because one of the things that's not to, so whenever I say that, people think that I'm like, okay, Ayman, he said I have to go. It was great talking to you. Thanks for your comments, Ayman. One of the things that, people I think take offense to is when I say something's maybe not like poetry in its essence. It's not to denigrate it. I mean, music is its own art form, and it's wonderful and beautiful. But one of the things that makes poetry, and as a literary essential thing, is that it rides on its own sound and meaning. So the sound of words is the most important thing. And when a poet is choosing words for a poem, they're thinking of what it will sound like. That's a really important part of it. The rhythm. When you're talking about with Dylan, his primary is going to be music, and he's setting words to music. And you even put it, he's the best at doing that. And I think that's right. I think he's great at putting these images and using many of the resources. And this is why he, has a poetic feel to him, and there is poetry in him for sure. I mean, that is poetry. I mean, there is a whole branch of poetry called lyrical poetry, right? As a wonderful book. One of my favorite books is called Lyrical Ballads by Coleridge and Wordsworth, which essentially launched the English Romantic movement in England, if not the whole Romantic movement to some degree. So I think that, it's definitely true that Dylan is very poetic. And I would just challenge you to think that is music, and it's wonderful and it's beautiful music. Now go get some poetry as well, right? Not to denigrate music, but just like as a separate thing. The way I put it is, if you are reading poetry always in your head, you're not reading poetry correctly. Poetry is meant to be heard as well as, read. So that's another thing I didn't really talk about, but I always recommend, especially at first, reading poetry out loud. It's very helpful. And hearing the words, feeling the rhythm, feeling the meter, that's important because, again, the words are front and center in a poem. And again, in the music here, maybe there's a good blend in Dylan, but I think the music is still somewhat front and center, more than the words, even though the words are better in Dylan than anybody else who writes lyrics.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It's just there's
that doesn't mean you shouldn't analyze the words of him. I'm not saying that, by the way.
No, but you clarified it when you said there is this genre called lyrical poetry, because there's some there's some lyrics that are absolutely fantastic within the context of song. And some a lot of the Beatles songs and some of the Rolling Stones songs and stuff. But if you take them out and read them as poetry, in inverted commas, they're just very pedestrian. Like it doesn't really even work as poetry.
It doesn't work as poetry. Yeah, if you read it, that's kind of the test, right?
But then when you put it, and then you get some people like Dylan and Leonard Cohen and people who it kind of can be on its own, but is better with the music.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a good way of thinking about it. Even Jerusalem, by the way, like you when you've heard it, you've probably heard it with the Rupert Perry symphony that goes along with it, but you can actually find a lot of choirs just singing it, and that has its own power. Like the music of it comes from the words. And when I talk about lyric poetry, it tends to be meant purely to be unaccompanied. And that's one way to think about it, is that, you know, with Dylan, you're hearing guitar, you might hear drums, or, you know, other instruments going on, you know, to kind of add to the harmony of what he's trying to convey. And that's wonderful. But with a poem, even a lyric poem, you know, it rides on the sounds of words.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, it's lovely. I mean, it's what I really like it. Are you able to post in the chat those couple of lines that Rand said about
poetry?
And that's why I put in the Spinoza quotation.
Oh, okay. I think I might have missed that one.
It was in reference to that all things excellent are as difficult as they are rare.
That's definitely true. Yeah. I mean, that's true of any art.
Yeah. And that's one of the great Spinoza quotations.
Yeah. But I think she's right in the sense that poetry is unique in its challenge of being good.
And that goes right back to what we were saying right at the beginning of when I said poetry is either excellent or terrible.
Yeah, and I think that's true. But what I would challenge, and this is why I'm confused with Rand, and I don't know enough, is that there is a sense that poetry, like I said, has to be the taste has to be developed. So you can't just like never have read poetry or read one or two, or, you know, got a little bit of, you know, school teachers punishing you with crap poetry or teaching it crappily, which happened to me, which is why I think I hated it my whole life. That can't be the only thing you get with poetry. And then you say, well, poetry's crap. No, that's not sufficient. You have to read some, you have to, you know, really dedicate yourself to getting over the hump of that initial challenge with it until you start feeling a little bit more comfortable. So you have to develop the taste. So Bob asked about Edgar Allan Poe's poetry. I love Edgar Allan Poe's poetry. Have you guys ever heard Annabel Lee by any chance?
Oh, man.
Bob, have you heard the poem Annabel Lee? Yeah. I love Annabel Lee. I think it's a wonderful, beautiful, haunting poem. So one of the things Poe does is he haunts your mind. And think about what that word means, haunts. It means there's a residue that kind of stays behind. And when you think about what a ghost is, that's what a ghost is. A ghost is the residue of a person left behind in this world, or that's usually how it's conveyed. And I think there is a haunting aspect to him that is hard that a lot of other poets don't quite capture. And what's really interesting about Poe is he believed that you could actually create poetry in almost a mathematical perfection. And he has a great essay, which I actually put on my magazine, troubadourmag.com, to kind of convey on the philosophy of composition. It's called The Philosophy of Composition. And he breaks down his poem, and I don't agree with him 100%, but his point is wonderful, that because he's in the age of reason. So he's like saying reason is wonderful. I love reason. Reason can, create trains, and it can create steam engines, and it can create great art. And he was denigrating the idea that we get today, that art is inspiration, that it comes from nowhere, or it comes from it's magical, it comes from the gods, which I think is an atrocious idea. Actually, I agree with Poe on this, that it's not this mystical thing, inspiration, that we get inspiration from things. It comes from our evaluations of the world. And I think even Wordsworth agreed with that in his own way. And I can talk about that later if you're interested, or some other time. But Poe, if you're interested, read philosophy, or read The Raven, or listen to it on YouTube. Christopher Walken The actor has a great reading of The Raven. He does a wonderful job. It is metrical. It is very precise, and it has a very specific rhyme scheme, rhythm. It's all meticulous, and it sounds wonderful. And then Annabel Lee is also a very haunting, beautiful poem that I would recommend people read as well. He has, there may be, I used to have this memorized, but here's a very short poem. You guys want to hear a quick poem? I don't know how much longer you guys have before I drive you insane. This is actually my favorite poem called El Dorado. Anybody heard of the poem El Dorado, Bob? No? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to tell you that I think most of the words are you'll know all of them. So there's not much you have to look up, but I'll say that bedight, so the first words are gaily bedight, a gallant knight. That's it. And all that means is a knight in all his accoutrements and all of his, attire of knightliness. And he's just going out there happily. Gaily bedight means attired and ready to go for action. Okay, so that's how it starts. It's quite a short poem. Actually, I might even be able to put it in the text here so you can see it as I read it real quick. Okay, so it's in the text. Gaily bedight, a gallant knight, in sunshine and in shadow, had journeyed long, singing a song in search of El Dorado. But he grew old, this knight so bold, and o'er his heart a shadow fell as he found no spot of ground that looked like El Dorado. And as his strength failed him at length, he met a pilgrim shadow. Shadow, said he, where can it be, this land of El Dorado? Over the mountains of the moon, down the valley of the shadow, ride, boldly ride, the shade replied, if you seek for El Dorado. Now, do you guys know what El Dorado is? I forgot. I don't know if it's as popular in Britain as it is in America.
Yeah, we know El Dorado.
Okay, just making sure. So otherwise that poem would not make any sense, of course. Yeah. So it is important that you know El Dorado is the land of gold, right? It's kind of a mythical land of gold. But that, like, do you hear, like, that has a rhyme. It sounded a certain way. I don't know if you guys want to think about like what it means, but I think it also has real meaning, and it has something to say about. So, when you think about like what experience does it convey in that sense? Anybody want to take a crack at it from just hearing it once?
Well, I've just found it very sad.
Oh yeah, very tragic.
Tragic.
What's tragic about it, or sad?
Well, because he's never going to get there.
He's never going to get there.
He's never get there, and the only the last verse is the one that hit me. The shade replied, that it's just so desperate by then.
Well, okay, so I would say that is, and this is a case where reading, like seeing it does help. So that is actually the pilgrim shadow that he interacts with. That's not the knight saying that.
Okay. Yeah.
So ride, boldly ride, the shade replied. That's the pilgrim shade. If you seek, so this is the advice he's getting from a pilgrim, a person who, but not just a pilgrim shade, right? That, so a pilgrim is someone who kind of travels around, going on a journey, essentially. So yeah, I think you're right. Sad is definitely true. He's going, think about it, but he grew old, this knight so bold, and o'er his heart a shadow fell as he found no spot of ground that looked like El Dorado. Now, by the way, I want to say that I shouldn't say you were wrong. You could interpret the pilgrim as that shadow that's over his heart, right? Like you could interpret that as like a separate entity that is also him in a sense. So you could look at it that way. But yeah, he's going out, in sunshine. He's gallant. Think about a time when you started a long-term project and you went out. I've tried all these, when I was younger, I started businesses, for instance, just like giving them a shot. And I went out like, I could do this. I could do anything. You know, I was going to sell art in people's offices. I like would not just art, but like, not like fancy art, but like poems attached to a like, basically office decor. And, you know, I like knocked on doors, and it was a gay night. Well, not to have too many connotations there, but, you know, gaily bedight, a gallant night. And I was like, yes, you know, you can't take me down. I'm excited. Right. And then, you know, singing a song, knocking on doors, trying to make things happen, like maybe trying to start a movement in Britain, right? Like you yes, I could do this. This is possible. And then, but he grew old, this knight so bold, and o'er his heart a shadow fell, as he found no spot of ground that looked like. It's like, no matter how hard I tried, wouldn't happen. Like I was not making enough sales to make it. I was like, oh, man, this is a grind. I don't, you know, I got older and older, and I was getting more tired and exhausted. And as his strength failed him at length, he met a pilgrim shadow. Shadow, said he, where can it be, this land of, you know, where is this? Help me. You've done this before, pilgrim, right? Like, what can you do? And the shadow says, over the mountains of the moon. Mountains of the moon? The hell is that? Where's the mountains of the moon? I don't know where that is. Like, that's just, you know, telling me that this is like going to be one hell of a journey. This is going to be one hell of a ride, you know, down the valley of the shadow. Valley of the shadow. So I have to go through this horrible, this land that I have to, you know, ride through to make it work. Ride, boldly ride. So he gives, you know, you go through hell and, you know, keep walking, as Churchill said, right? When you're going through hell, but keep going. And the shade replied, if you seek for El Dorado, if you do seek it, just keep moving. That's the advice the shade gives. And it's like, I feel like that whole journey encapsulates the feeling I've had when I've tried businesses that didn't work out when I was younger. And I don't know if you guys got that, but I think it conveys that experience quite well.
I think one of the other sad things that I experienced is you've got this opening verse that's uplifting, and immediately the second verse is worn and battered. There was no middle stage. There's no journey from that first verse to the second verse. It's just beginning and end straight away. Yeah.
He definitely is beaten by life. He's optimistic at the beginning, and then he's beaten by life. Now, does anybody see anything else in it? I'm just curious if anybody wants to. Maybe people who have been quiet. I'm looking at the 4 blank screens over here. Nobody wants to try what they felt with the poem, what they thought it conveyed?
If anybody wants to answer live, then raise your hand, and if not, you can type in the chat.
It's okay if not. It's all right. It's so this was written in the mid 1800s. I don't know if you guys know the history of America much, or how much you know about it. I'm sure you know something, but do you know what was going on in California during that time?
It's the gold rush.
Yeah, it's the gold rush. So he's writing this around the time of the gold rush. And now there's the negative feeling that you got, but there's also something oddly positive about it, in my view, in the sense that even if you don't find El Dorado, you should still boldly ride. And that there's something in the power of the journey is important in this poem, that you may never get the full El Dorado. You may not really land in that city of gold that you wanted, and you know all your pleasures and all your dreams are accomplished like in a snap of the fingers, and you're assaulted, ready to, you know, live in lavish luxury for the rest of your life. But there is a value in the boldly riding and still pursuing that journey and going for it, in a sense. And it's got this tragic feeling to it, but I think it also has like this odd optimism of the value of just going for things. Because it's not saying don't go for it, like don't like stop. It's saying, hey, you want that El Dorado, boldly ride. Yeah, your strength's gonna go, you're gonna grow old, it's gonna be difficult, you may feel like, you may doubt that you're actually gonna find anything. And the advice is, yeah, you're gonna have to, it's gonna be worse. You're gonna have to go over the mountains of the moon. Like, it's gonna be a hell of a journey. You have to go through that. Anyone who fights for the future. Thank you, Bob. That's wonderful. Yeah. Anyone who fights for the future lives in it today. I think that sums it up beautifully. Yeah, absolutely. Which is of course a quote by Ayn Rand. So, I think it conveys all that. And it is very tragic and sad and difficult and hard to read to some degree because it conveys so much negative power and how difficult things are going to be. But it's like that movie. Anybody see the movie Whiplash?
Yeah. Great movie.
So great. That guy, he was, although, he didn't grow old literally, but he definitely grew up real fast, right? He definitely was at his last strength with his bloody knuckles and his hands were tired and he was exhausted. And yet, even after he had all that torture of him, he still had to go over the mountain of the moon, right? He still had to confront his enemy, to walk through the valley of the shadow, which is a reference to the Bible, walk through the valley of the shadow of death, right? So he still had to go through that. And, now in the movie, of course, I won't give away the ending, but what, for those who didn't see it, but what happened. But that movie really stresses the difficulty of things and how horribly challenging it can be to try to do anything great. So that's Poe. Yeah. No, sorry.
The reason I asked that question, I put on the chat, any thoughts on Rambo is just that he's referenced by so many people. But I've never read any of him, and I know that he burned out incredibly young. And I don't know if he is if it's just trendy and cool to like him, or if there's artistic credit to his work. Because first-handedly, I've never read it, and I'm just wondering what.
Yeah. So my experience with French poetry is very limited, so I don't want to or like to.
Fair enough.
Comment on stuff too much. I've read some poetry by Victor Hugo and Baudelaire, who wrote quite nicely about cities, actually. And he does have some things, but it's always translated. I don't speak French, and that's part of the problem with reading other languages that you don't read or speak, is that you lose, because so much of it rides on the connotations and the denotations and the sounds that you have to make. And, as me as an American, if I try to, speak French or any language really, like even English, like I'm going to butcher it and make it Americanized. And, in my own dialect and my own way of speaking. And that is really hard when you're reading poetry. In fact, it's one of the difficult things when reading even Shakespeare, is that it's 500 years ago. And so the language has changed a little bit. The way we say words has changed. And so our experience of it is a little bit changed. That's not to say it's bad or, that you can't experience it, but it is different. It's kind of difficult sometimes because of that. Words have literally changed. Like when he talks about like words like nice or something like that, like he literally means something quite different than what we mean. So, so I hope you guys experience more poetry, and you guys are an awesome group. When are you guys going to be meeting in person in the future?
So we started, we have these meetups on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Saturdays, and we started reintroducing the in-person option for Wednesdays. It's only for members of the Ayn Rand Center UK, and it's here in the WeWork, where the world headquarters, as I call this,
okay,
are. Our local restaurant where we have our private room where we meet is not going to open until late August at the earliest. So
now, go ahead.
Well, for now we're doing this and hopefully slowly introducing this combo of online and in person.
Yeah. Well, when you guys are trapped, there are a lot, it's a good opportunity to expand your, to travel in other ways. Like I said, Keats called it traveling on the realms of gold. And I recommend that. And, he meant traveling in the world of fiction, right? Right when you hear the words realms of gold, you're not in the hustle bustle of the city, that skyscraper. You're not in the paying your taxes world. You're not in the world of your prime minister or of, you know, the big orange man in my country. That's not the world you're in anymore. You're in a different realm. You've went through a portal, and there's something missing in our culture today in the West. Definitely in America. I can't speak for Britain or anywhere else, but definitely in America, I've sensed this very intensely, that there's something missing. You get it sometimes in songs, you get it a little bit in movies. I was a film major, so I love movies, and you get it in some TV. You know, it's there. I think the expression and communication of experience is there a little bit, and the traveling on the realms of gold, the going someplace. And I really stress, you know, people call reading fiction escapism. I don't think it's escapism. The connotation being not dealing with reality. I think, but I do like the feeling of escapism in the sense of traveling somewhere, and that you're going somewhere. And that is true. And, you know, there's no better time than when you're trapped in your room to go somewhere that you haven't been before, to travel the realms of gold, to meet Achilles and Yvonne and, you know, Cyrano, if you met them, you know, to go to where Schiller's, like, there's so many great things to experience,
Well,
even when you're at home. Not to say you shouldn't fight to be free again, by the way, but don't give up. Still fight for your freedom. I know I did.
if one of the desired effects of this evening is to get people who might not be into poetry, get them interested, I can speak for one of those people and say it has definitely worked. And a massive thank you to you, Kirk. The website is troubadourmag.com. If you are live on this call, it's in the chat. If you're watching on YouTube, it's in the description. So yeah, thank you both. And I hope everybody will join us for the next meetups on Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday. I know I post them quite late, but unless there's something unusual, we will be here at 7 p.m. UK time on each of these 3 days. And we also have a Facebook Live show now, The Daily Objective, every day. It's 20 minutes. It's worth your 20 minutes. Nikos and Gloria Alvarez will be on this Monday. So yeah, thanks again.
Do you guys have that as a podcast by any chance? Are you going to make that a podcast?
Yes. So that's now on Spotify from today. And
okay, good.
It will be listed on Apple, on iTunes, and Google Podcasts soon. These shows are already on the podcast as the Ayn Rand Center UK podcast, but the Daily is just on
Ayn Rand. So I will subscribe to those. I wasn't aware.
Awesome. Yeah, we only migrated to audio very recently, and yeah, I think we should have done it a long time ago, but glad we are doing this. So now people have no excuse not to consume this content that we produce. So thanks everybody again, and see you all Monday.